I never thought my life would turn into something you'd watch in a TV drama. But then again, whoever does? The morning I caught my husband cheating, he looked me dead in the eye and called me paranoid. That single word shattered 42 years of marriage into a million tiny pieces I'm still trying to sweep up. I'm sharing this with you today because maybe you'll understand what I'm going through. Or maybe you know someone who needs to hear this. If this story touches your heart, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe. These stories need to reach the people who need them most, and your support helps me do that. It means more than you know. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a modest 2-story house in Queens, New York, the same house where I raised 3 children and built what I thought was a solid life. Every morning for the past 15 years, I've taken the same walk through our neighborhood. It's my ritual, my meditation, my escape from the suffocating routine that my marriage has become. I wear my old purple windbreaker, the one with the frayed cuffs that Richard always criticizes, and my comfortable walking shoes that have molded to every bunion and callus on my aging feet. That particular morning in late September, the air had that crisp quality that signals autumn is taking hold. Leaves were just beginning to turn golden at the edges. I left the house at 6:30. Same as always, kissing Richard on the forehead as he pretended to sleep. I say pretended because I knew he was awake. After 4 decades of marriage, you learn the difference between real sleep and the kind where someone is just waiting for you to leave the room. I walked my usual route, down Maple Avenue past the bodega where Mr. Chen always waves from behind the counter, then left onto Forest Drive where the old oak trees form a canopy over the sidewalk. The morning light filtered through the leaves in that magical way that makes everything look softer, kinder than it really is. I had my phone tucked in my pocket, and my earbuds were playing old Sinatra songs because that's what women my age are supposed to listen to, right? At least that's what Richard always said when I tried to put on anything more modern. About 20 minutes into my walk, I realized I'd forgotten to silence my phone. It buzzed with a notification, and I pulled it out, annoyed at the interruption to my peaceful moment. But it wasn't my phone that had buzzed, it was Richard's. In my distracted state that morning, rushing to get out before he started his usual complaints about breakfast, I'd grabbed his phone instead of mine. They looked identical, same model, same black case, but his had a small scratch on the corner that I recognized immediately once I looked closer. My first instinct was to turn around and bring it back to him. Richard was particular about his phone, always keeping it close, always checking it throughout the day. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the small voice in my head that had been whispering doubts for months now. Maybe it was just exhaustion from years of feeling invisible in my own home. Whatever it was, I looked at the screen. The notification was from someone named Jennifer. The preview showed just enough to make my stomach drop. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." There was a heart emoji next to the words, red and throbbing with implications that made my hands shake. I stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, as Mrs. Patterson walked by with her miniature poodle. She said good morning, but I couldn't respond. My throat had closed up, and my vision had gone blurry at the edges. I blinked hard, trying to clear my head, trying to convince myself that I was misreading the situation. Maybe Jennifer was a colleague. Maybe it was about a work project. Maybe I was being paranoid. But I wasn't paranoid. I was finally seeing clearly after years of walking around with blinders on. I made my way to a bench near the entrance to Forest Park and sat down heavily. My legs had turned to water. With trembling fingers, I unlocked Richard's phone. I knew his password because he'd never bothered to hide it from me. Why would he? I was his wife, his partner, the woman who'd given up her own dreams to support his career as a financial advisor. I was trustworthy, reliable, boring Margaret, who would never think to snoop. The password was our wedding anniversary. The irony of that wasn't lost on me as my shaking fingers tapped out the numbers. Each digit felt like a small betrayal, unlocking a door I'd never wanted to open, but somehow always knew existed. The messages between Richard and Jennifer went back 6 months. 6 months of daily conversations, flirtations, plans to meet when I was out of the house or visiting our daughter in Boston. 6 months of him complaining about me, calling me needy, saying I was suffocating him, claiming that I'd let myself go and that living with me felt like being trapped in a museum where everything was old and dusty. I scrolled through the messages with a sick fascination, unable to stop even though each word felt like a physical blow. He'd sent her photos of places we'd been together on vacation, reframing our shared memories as evidence of his unhappiness. He'd made jokes about my cooking, my appearance, the way I laughed, all the small, intimate details of our life together weaponized for her amusement. In one message, he'd called me utterly forgettable, and I actually gasped out loud, the sound startling a nearby pigeon into flight. I read every message, torturing myself with each revelation. They'd been meeting at a hotel in Manhattan twice a week. He'd told her he was planning to leave me once he figured out the finances. He'd said I was paranoid and imagining problems in our marriage when really everything was my fault for not being more understanding, more independent, more interesting. The word paranoid appeared 17 times in those messages. 17 times he'd dismissed my concerns, my intuition, my legitimate questions about where he was going and why he was so distant. 17 times he'd made me doubt my own sanity. I sat on that bench for 2 hours, reading and rereading, my morning walk forgotten. The sun climbed higher, and the park filled with joggers and mothers pushing strollers, and still I sat there, phone clutched in my hands like evidence at a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like. A crime. A theft of years and trust and the future I'd imagined for us. When I finally stood up, my joints ached from sitting so long in the cool morning air. I walked home slowly, no longer seeing the beautiful autumn morning around me. Everything looked gray now, drained of color and meaning. I let myself in through the front door, and Richard was in the kitchen, dressed for work in one of the expensive suits I'd helped him pick out, drinking coffee from the mug our oldest son had given him for Father's Day 10 years ago. He looked up when I entered, and I saw the flash of panic cross his face when he realized I was holding his phone. "Margaret," he said, and his voice had that careful quality, the one he used when talking to particularly difficult clients. "I've been looking for that everywhere." I placed the phone on the kitchen counter between us, a small black rectangle that contained the explosive truth of our marriage. My hand was surprisingly steady as I let it go, watching it slide slightly across the granite we'd picked out together 15 years ago. Everything in this house held memories that now felt contaminated, poisoned by the knowledge of his deception. "You called me paranoid," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. "In these messages with Jennifer, you told her I was paranoid." I watched the color drain from his face, watched him set down his coffee mug with exaggerated care, buying himself time to formulate a response. I'd seen him do this 1,000 times in our marriage, that calculated pause before he spoke, choosing his words like weapons. "Margaret, let me explain." 17 times, I continued, cutting him off. The number had burned itself into my brain during those 2 hours on the park bench. "You used that word 17 times. Every time I asked where you were going, every time I mentioned that you seemed distant, every time I tried to talk about us, you made me feel crazy. You made me doubt myself. And all along, you were the one lying." He tried to approach me, reaching out with those hands I'd held for over 4 decades, hands that had now touched someone else while he was still wearing his wedding ring. I stepped back, feeling like if he touched me, I might shatter completely. "Don't," I said. "Just don't." The rest of that day passed in a blur. Richard tried various approaches, denial, then anger, then bargaining. then back to making me feel like I was overreacting. He said it wasn't serious with Jennifer, that it was just a mistake, that he still loved me, that we could work through this if I would just calm down and be reasonable. He used that word, reasonable, as if my pain and betrayal were unreasonable responses to his calculated deception. That night, I lay in the guest room, the one we decorated for when the grandchildren visited, surrounded by cheerful yellow walls and photographs of family gatherings where everyone smiled like we were perfect. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying moments from our marriage, re-examining them through this new lens of understanding. How many times had he lied to me? How many of those late nights at the office were actually with her? How many times had he looked me in the eye and made me feel foolish for trusting my instincts? I thought about all the years I'd dedicated to this man, to this marriage, to building a life that was apparently nothing but a comfortable lie. I'd given up my job as a teacher when our first child was born because Richard had insisted one of us needed to be home full-time. I'd supported his career moves, relocating twice for better opportunities for him. I'd managed our household, raised our children, cared for his aging mother when she'd lived with us for 5 years before passing away. I'd been the one who planned every holiday, remembered every birthday, maintained relationships with both sides of the family. What had I gotten in return? A husband who complained about me to his mistress. A man who called me paranoid when I was actually being perceptive. A partnership that was apparently more one-sided than I'd ever realized. The next morning, I didn't take my walk. I couldn't face our neighborhood. Couldn't bear the thought of passing the bench where my world had cracked open. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and made a list, something concrete to anchor me in this shifting reality. On one side of the paper, I wrote down everything I'd sacrificed for this marriage. On the other side, I wrote down what I'd received in return. The imbalance was staggering when I saw it laid out in black and white. Richard came downstairs already dressed for work, clearly planning to pretend nothing had happened. He poured his coffee and started to talk about his day as if we were still the couple we'd been 2 days ago. I interrupted him. "I want you to leave," I said. He stared at me. "What?" "I want you to pack a bag and stay somewhere else while I figure out what I'm going to do. I can't think with you here. I can't breathe with you here." His expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, indignation, calculation. "Margaret, you're being dramatic. Can't we talk about this like adults?" There it was again, the implication that I was the problem, that my response was inappropriate, that I was being unreasonable. "You made me feel crazy for months," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "You gaslit me, that's what it's called, while you were sleeping with someone else. You don't get to tell me how to react now." He left for work without packing a bag, probably assuming I'd calm down by evening. I spent the day calling people I should have called sooner. My best friend Susan, who'd moved to Florida 3 years ago, but still checked in regularly. My daughter Emily, who lived in Boston with her husband and 2 children. My son James, who worked in finance like his father and lived in Manhattan. Each conversation was excruciating, admitting that my marriage was falling apart, that I'd been so blind, that I needed help understanding what to do next. Emily cried on the phone, her sobs making it hard to understand her words. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she kept saying, as if she was somehow responsible for her father's choices. "I noticed things over the years, the way he talked to you, how dismissive he was. I should have said something." "Sweetheart, this isn't your fault," I told her, even though my own voice was breaking. "You couldn't have known. I didn't even want to know." When I called James, he went completely silent for nearly a minute after I told him. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him processing the information, trying to reconcile the father he knew with this new reality. "I'm coming over," he finally said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Right now?" "No, honey, I need some time alone to think, but thank you." James got angry then, his words tumbling out in a rush. He said he'd always known his father was selfish, but never thought he'd do something like this. He told me stories I'd never heard about how Richard had criticized his choice to go into therapy years ago, had made cruel jokes about his sensitivity. "He's always been like this, Mom," James said, "making people feel small so he can feel big." Susan offered to fly up immediately, and I told her not to yet, that I needed to process everything first. But talking to them helped, made me feel less alone in this nightmare I was living. Each conversation stripped away another layer of isolation, reminded me that I had people who loved me, who believed me, who wouldn't call me paranoid for recognizing the truth. That evening, Richard came home with flowers, grocery store roses that looked wilted and obligatory. He suggested we go to counseling, that we could work through this if I was willing to forgive him. "Every marriage has rough patches," he said, as if infidelity was just a minor bump in the road. Jennifer didn't mean anything. It was just, I don't know, a midlife crisis or something. "You're 75 years old," I pointed out. "That's not midlife unless you're planning to live to 150. He didn't appreciate my sarcasm. We argued for hours, going in circles, with him trying to minimize what he'd done and me trying to make him understand the magnitude of his betrayal. Eventually, he went to bed, and I returned to the guest room, our house divided into armed camps. The following weeks were a special kind of hell. Richard refused to leave, claiming he had as much right to be there as I did since his income had paid for most of the house. He was technically correct, even though I'd maintained our home and raised our children and sacrificed my own career. The law didn't really account for that kind of contribution, or at least not in a way that felt fair to me. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Ramona Chen, a woman in her 50s who specialized in helping people navigate major life transitions. She was the one who first used the term gaslighting to describe what Richard had been doing to me. She explained that gaslighting was a form of psychological manipulation where someone makes another person question their own perception of reality. By constantly calling me paranoid when I'd noticed legitimate red flags, Richard had been undermining my trust in my own judgment. "You weren't paranoid," Dr. Chen said during one of our sessions, leaning forward in her chair with an intensity that made me actually believe her. "You were paying attention. There's a difference." I remember sitting in her office that day, surrounded by plants and soft lighting, feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in months. The validation was almost overwhelming. I'd spent so long being told that my perceptions were wrong, that I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive or too demanding. "But I questioned myself so much," I said, tears streaming down my face. I'd notice something off, and then I'd talk myself out of it. I'd think, "You're being ridiculous, Margaret. Richard's just stressed from work. You're being paranoid." "That's what gaslighting does," Dr. Chen explained gently. "It makes you internalize the gaslighter's narrative. You started doing his work for him, doubting yourself before he even had to manipulate you. It's insidious." Those words unlocked something in me. For months, I'd been doubting myself, wondering if I was too suspicious, too jealous, too needy. But I wasn't any of those things. I was a woman whose husband was cheating on her and lying about it, and my instincts had been trying to tell me the truth that my husband was actively denying. Dr. Chen also helped me understand the pattern of our marriage more clearly. Richard had been slowly erasing me for years, long before Jennifer entered the picture. He dismissed my opinions during family dinners, talked over me when I tried to contribute to conversations, made decisions about our finances and our lives without consulting me. When Emily had wanted to go to art school instead of pursuing a more practical degree, I'd supported her. But Richard had overruled both of us, insisting she major in business instead. When James had struggled with anxiety in college, I'd suggested therapy, but Richard had said our son just needed to toughen up and stop being so sensitive. In 1,000 small ways, Richard had communicated that my thoughts, my feelings, my perspectives didn't matter as much as his did, and I'd internalized that message, making myself smaller and quieter and less demanding over the years. I'd convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. But now the peace was already broken, shattered by his betrayal, and I had nothing left to lose by finally speaking up. I started documenting everything. I screenshot the messages between Richard and Jennifer before he could delete them. I made copies of our financial records, discovering in the process that he'd been spending thousands of dollars on his affair, money that came from our joint accounts, money that was partially mine. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, gifts that I'd never received, all charged to credit cards that I'd helped pay off with my careful budgeting and bargain shopping. The financial betrayal was almost as devastating as the emotional one. For years, Richard had criticized my spending, questioned whether I really needed a new winter coat or if the old one would do for another season, suggested I cut back on my book purchases and use the library instead. Meanwhile, he'd been lavishing attention and money on another woman without a second thought. I consulted with a divorce attorney, something I never thought I'd do. Her name was Patricia Morrison, and she was recommended by Susan, who'd used her when she divorced her own husband a decade ago. Patricia was in her 60s, sharp and no nonsense, and she laid out my options with brutal honesty. "You're entitled to half of everything," she said, spreading papers across her desk. "The house, his retirement accounts, his investments. New York is an equitable distribution state, which means the court tries to divide assets fairly, though not always equally. But given the length of your marriage and your contributions as a homemaker, you're in a strong position." The word homemaker rankled. It sounded so diminutive, so insignificant compared to financial advisor. But Patricia explained that courts increasingly recognize the value of domestic labor, the child rearing and household management that enabled the other spouse to build their career. "You made his success possible," she said. "Don't ever forget that." I also learned that Richard's affair could impact the divorce settlement, particularly because he'd used marital funds to support it. Patricia explained that while New York was a no-fault divorce state, meaning I didn't need to prove his adultery to end the marriage, the court could still consider his wasteful dissipation of marital assets when dividing property. Armed with this information, I felt stronger, more in control. I wasn't just a victim of Richard's betrayal. I had rights, options, the power to shape my own future. Meanwhile, Richard continued his campaign to convince me that I was overreacting. He'd switched tactics from denial to making himself the victim. He complained to our children that I was being vindictive, that I wasn't giving him a chance to make things right, that he'd made one mistake and I was throwing away 4 decades over it. He told his siblings that I'd become paranoid and controlling, twisting the narrative to make himself look sympathetic. Some family members believed him, at least initially. His younger brother Michael called me one evening, suggesting that maybe I should be more forgiving, that marriage required compromise and understanding. I hung up on him mid-sentence, something I'd never done before in my life. The satisfaction of that small rebellion was enormous. Emily and James were firmly on my side, but that caused its own complications. Emily stopped speaking to her father entirely, which made him blame me for turning our children against him. James tried to maintain a relationship with both of us, but I could see the strain it put on him, the careful way he had to navigate conversations, never mentioning one parent to the other. The worst part was how my marriage had become public entertainment for our extended family and social circle. People chose sides, passed judgment, offered unsolicited advice. Some of Richard's golf buddies stopped inviting me to couples events, apparently assuming the divorce was partly my fault. Some of my friends from the neighborhood were sympathetic, but also curious in a way that felt invasive, wanting details about the affair that I didn't want to share. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like my private pain had become a spectacle for others to watch and comment on. And through it all, Richard maintained that I was being paranoid, that people weren't really talking about us as much as I thought, that I was imagining judgment where none existed. But I wasn't imagining anything. I was finally seeing clearly for the first time in years. And what I saw was that I'd built my entire adult life around a man who didn't respect me, who'd actively deceived me, who'd made me doubt my own perceptions to protect his lies. The breaking point came 3 months after I'd discovered the affair. Richard came home one evening and announced that he'd invited Jennifer to our grandson's birthday party. "She's a part of my life now," he said, as if that explained everything. "The kids need to get used to her." I stared at him in disbelief. We weren't even officially separated yet, let alone divorced. And he wanted to parade his mistress in front of our family at a child's birthday party. The audacity was breathtaking. "Absolutely not," I said. "You're being unreasonable," he replied, and there was that word again, weaponized against me. "Emily said I could bring a guest." I called Emily immediately and discovered that Richard had lied. Emily had said no such thing. In fact, she'd explicitly told her father that he wasn't welcome at the party if he was going to bring Jennifer. Richard had simply assumed he could manipulate the situation, or maybe he'd hoped I wouldn't check his story. That's when I realized that Richard would never stop lying, never stop twisting reality to suit his needs, never acknowledge the harm he'd caused. He couldn't, because doing so would require him to see himself clearly, and that was something he was fundamentally incapable of doing. I filed for divorce the next day. Patricia had all the paperwork ready, and I signed my name on the forms with a strange mixture of grief and relief. 42 years of marriage ended with a few signatures and filing fees. It felt simultaneously monumental and anticlimactic. Richard was served with divorce papers at his office, which humiliated him in front of his colleagues. He called me screaming, accusing me of deliberately embarrassing him, of being vindictive and petty. I listened to his rage calmly, no longer affected by his attempts to make me feel guilty for his own actions. "You did this to yourself," I told him before hanging up. "You called me paranoid when I was right all along. You can't gaslight me anymore." The divorce process was long and ugly. Richard fought me on everything, trying to minimize what I was entitled to, claiming that his investments were his alone, that I hadn't contributed financially to our marriage, so I didn't deserve an equal share. He hired an expensive attorney who tried every tactic to reduce my settlement. But Patricia was better. She documented my decades of unpaid domestic labor, the career opportunities I'd sacrificed, the way I'd enabled Richard's professional success by handling everything at home. She demonstrated his wasteful spending on the affair, showing the court receipts for hotel rooms and gifts and dinners that had cost thousands of dollars over 6 months. She called Emily and James as witnesses to testify about my role in raising them, the countless hours I'd spent helping with homework and driving to activities and supporting their dreams even when their father had dismissed them. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Barbara Hernandez, was clearly unimpressed with Richard's arguments. When his attorney tried to downplay the significance of the affair, suggesting that Jennifer was irrelevant to the division of assets, Judge Hernandez cut him off. "Your client used marital funds to support an extramarital relationship while criticizing his wife's spending on necessities," she said. "That's absolutely relevant." The final settlement gave me half of everything: the house, Richard's retirement accounts, his investment portfolio, and half the value of his financial advising practice. It also awarded me substantial spousal support since I'd been out of the workforce for decades and had no independent income. Richard was furious, ranting about how I'd stolen his life's work, but I felt only a cold satisfaction. The law had finally recognized what Richard never would, that my contributions to our marriage had real value, even if they didn't come with a paycheck. But winning in court didn't erase the pain of what had happened or undo the years of gaslighting and manipulation. I'd gotten justice in a legal sense, but the emotional wounds ran deep, deeper than I'd realized at first. That's when Beth entered my life, though in some ways she'd always been there in the background. Beth Morrison was my neighbor 4 houses down, a widow in her late 60s who'd lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier. We'd been friendly but never close, exchanging pleasantries when we saw each other, but not much more than that. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after my divorce was finalized, I was sitting on my front porch feeling particularly low. The house felt too big and too empty now that Richard was gone. Emily had offered to move back in with me, but I'd refused, not wanting to upend her life in Boston. I was trying to adjust to living alone for the first time since I was a college student, and it was harder than I'd expected. Beth walked by with her golden retriever, a gentle old dog named Charlie. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and looked at me with such kindness that I felt tears starting to form. "You want to take a walk with us?" she asked. "Charlie doesn't move very fast these days, so we won't tire you out." I surprised myself by saying yes. I hadn't left the house in days except to see Dr. Chen. And the thought of moving, of doing something as simple as walking, felt both impossible and necessary. We walked slowly around the neighborhood, not talking much at first, just enjoying the mild spring weather and Charlie's enthusiastic sniffing of every tree and bush we passed. The silence between us was comfortable, not awkward or demanding. Beth didn't ask questions or offer platitudes. She just walked beside me, occasionally pointing out a garden she particularly liked or a new addition to someone's porch. Eventually, Beth started telling me about her own experience with loss, the grief of watching her husband deteriorate from cancer, the strange adjustment to widowhood, the loneliness that came in waves even years later. Her voice was matter-of-fact but tender, sharing her story as a gift rather than a comparison. "People think you get used to it," she said, pausing to let Charlie investigate a particularly interesting fire hydrant. "And in some ways you do, but you also carry it with you always, that sense of something missing. The phantom limb of a life you thought you'd live." I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone else, maybe because she wasn't family and hadn't been part of the drama of my divorce. I told her about the messages I'd found on Richard's phone, the months of gaslighting, the feeling that I'd wasted 42 years of my life on someone who hadn't valued me. Beth listened without judgment or unsolicited advice. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me. "You didn't waste those years. You lived them fully, giving your best to people who didn't deserve it. That speaks to who you are, not who they are. And now you get to decide what comes next." That conversation was the beginning of a real friendship. Beth and I started walking together every morning, re-establishing the routine that I'd abandoned after discovering Richard's affair. We talked about everything and nothing, shared our fears and hopes, laughed at the absurdities of aging and the strange freedom that came with it. Through Beth, I met other women in the neighborhood who were also navigating life transitions, divorce, widowhood, retirement. We started having coffee together once a week, a casual gathering that turned into something more meaningful. These women understood what I was going through in a way that younger people couldn't. They'd lived long enough to see dreams derailed, relationships end, plans change. They'd survived losses and betrayals and disappointments, and they'd found ways to keep going. For the first time in years, I felt seen and heard and valued for myself, not for what I could do for someone else. These women didn't need me to cook their meals or manage their schedules or sacrifice my own needs for theirs. They just wanted my company, my perspective, my presence. I also started rediscovering parts of myself that I'd buried during my marriage. I joined a book club that met at the local library, discussing contemporary fiction and memoirs instead of the classic literature that Richard had insisted were the only books worth reading. The first time I shared my opinion about a book, and the other women actually listened, nodding and engaging with my thoughts instead of talking over me, I almost cried. It was such a small thing being heard, but it felt revolutionary. I took a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was managing a household and family. The instructor, a vibrant woman named Rosa, who wore paint-splattered overalls and had silver streaks in her long black hair, encouraged experimentation over perfection. "There are no mistakes in watercolor," she'd say, "only happy accidents." I wasn't particularly talented, but I loved the meditative quality of mixing colors and watching them flow across paper. I loved how the paint bloomed and spread in unpredictable ways when I added water, how I couldn't control every aspect of the outcome. After decades of trying to manage everything in my life, trying to be perfect enough that Richard wouldn't have any reason to criticize me, there was something deeply freeing about creating art that was messy and imperfect and entirely mine. I traveled too, small trips at first, visiting Emily in Boston and spending a week with Susan in Florida. Being with Susan felt like coming home to myself. We stayed up late talking, drinking wine on her lanai while the Florida humidity wrapped around us like a warm blanket. She told me I looked different, lighter somehow, and I realized she was right. The weight of pretending everything was fine, of managing Richard's moods and expectations, had been lifted. Then I got braver, booking a tour of Ireland with a group of solo travelers, mostly women over 60. The night before I left, I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest. Richard had never wanted to travel anywhere that wasn't a predictable resort with a golf course. The unknown had always made him uncomfortable, and I'd absorbed that discomfort as my own. But standing in the airport with my passport and a suitcase I'd packed myself, making my own choices about what to bring and what to leave behind, I felt powerful. We spent 2 weeks exploring castles and coastal villages, drinking Guinness in pubs and sharing stories about our lives. It was magical, freeing, exactly what I'd needed. I stood on the cliffs of Moher with the wind whipping my hair and the Atlantic stretching endlessly before me, and I felt like I could breathe all the way down to my toes for the first time in decades. My children noticed the change in me. Emily said I seemed lighter, more present. James commented that I smiled more. Even my grandchildren responded differently to me, drawn to this version of Grandma who was relaxed and playful instead of tired and stressed. But the transformation wasn't linear or simple. I still had days where I felt overwhelmed by anger at Richard, by grief for the marriage I thought I had, by fear about my future. Some nights I lay awake wondering if I'd done the right thing by divorcing him, if I'd thrown away something salvageable, if I should have tried harder to forgive. Dr. Chen helped me work through those doubts, reminding me that forgiveness didn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior, that I could acknowledge the good parts of my marriage while still recognizing that it had become toxic. She also helped me understand that Richard's gaslighting had done real psychological damage, undermining my confidence and my trust in my own judgment. Rebuilding that trust was a process, not an event. And then came the final twist. The moment that confirmed I'd made the right choice, even though it hurt like hell to have my worst suspicions validated. It was about 8 months after our divorce was finalized. I was having lunch with Emily when she casually mentioned that her father and Jennifer had broken up. Apparently, Jennifer had decided that dating a divorced man in his 70s wasn't as exciting as she'd thought it would be, especially once he was no longer spending lavishly on her with someone else's money. "He's been calling me," Emily said, picking at her salad, complaining that Jennifer was just using him for his money, that she never really loved him. It's like he has zero self-awareness. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Part of me wanted to call Richard and say, "I told you so," to rub his face in the consequences of his choices. But mostly I just felt tired, exhausted by the drama that had consumed so much of the past year. What Emily told me next, though, made my blood run cold. "Dad asked me if I thought you might consider getting back together," she said, not meeting my eyes. "He said he made a mistake, that he realizes now that you were the best thing in his life, that he wants another chance." I sat there in stunned silence. After everything he'd put me through, the lies and betrayal and gaslighting, Richard thought he could just apologize and have me take him back. The audacity was staggering. "What did you tell him?" I finally managed to ask. "I told him he was delusional," Emily said, and there was anger in her voice, protective fury on my behalf. "I told him that you'd moved on, that you were happy, that he'd destroyed any chance of reconciliation when he called you paranoid for catching him cheating." But Richard didn't give up that easily. He started showing up at places he knew I'd be: the grocery store, the library, the coffee shop where my book club met. He'd approach me with flowers or small gifts, apologizing and begging for another chance. He told me that Jennifer had meant nothing, that I was his true love, that he couldn't live without me. Each encounter was excruciating. Part of me, the part that had loved him for over 40 years, felt pulled toward him by the weight of our history. But the stronger part, the part that had learned to trust myself again, recognized his words for what they were: manipulation, one more attempt to control me and reshape reality to suit his needs. The breaking point came when Richard showed up at my house unannounced one evening. He had a key, since the house had been ours together for decades, and he let himself in without knocking. I was in the living room reading when I heard the door open, and for a moment I felt genuine fear, wondering if he was drunk or angry or desperate enough to do something violent. My heart hammered in my chest, and I found myself calculating the distance to my phone, to the back door, to anything I could use to defend myself if necessary. It shocked me to realize I was afraid of the man I'd shared a bed with for over 40 years. What did that say about our marriage? What did it say about me that I'd never acknowledged that underlying current of unease until now? But he wasn't angry. He was crying, actually crying, tears running down his face as he begged me to take him back. He dropped to his knees in front of me, a 75-year-old man on the floor of what used to be our home, promising he'd changed, that he'd do anything to make things right. The scene would have been touching if it hadn't been so manipulative. I could see him watching me through his tears, gauging my reaction, adjusting his performance based on what he saw in my face. It was the same calculated emotion I'd seen him use with difficult clients, manufactured vulnerability designed to get what he wanted. I looked at him kneeling there, and all I felt was pity. Not love, not even residual affection, just sad pity for this man who'd burned down his own life and was now realizing what he'd lost. "Richard," I said quietly, "you need to leave, and you need to give me back your key." "Margaret, please." "No," I interrupted. "You had 42 years to treat me with respect and honesty. You chose instead to lie to me, gaslight me, and cheat on me. You called me paranoid when my instincts were telling me the truth. You made me doubt myself, made me feel crazy, all so you could protect your affair. I can't trust you. I won't ever trust you again. And without trust, there's no foundation for a relationship." He tried to argue, to convince me that we could rebuild that trust, but I was done listening. I called James and asked him to come get his father, and I waited in silence while Richard alternated between crying and trying to change my mind. When James arrived, he looked embarrassed and angry, apologizing for his father's behavior as he let him out. After they left, I sat alone in my living room for a long time, processing what had just happened. It would have been so easy to give in, to let Richard back into my life, to try to recreate what we'd once had. Part of me wanted that, wanted the familiar comfort of our old routines, even if those routines had been killing me slowly. But I'd come too far to go back. I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up, learned to trust my own perceptions, created a life that was mine alone. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, capable of surviving losses I thought would destroy me. That night I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed on my house. It was a symbolic gesture, as much as a practical one, physically shutting Richard out of my space and my life. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I felt a sense of finality that was both painful and freeing. The next morning, I took Beth up on an invitation I'd been considering for weeks. She'd mentioned that a group of women from our neighborhood were planning a month-long trip to Italy in the fall, touring different regions and staying in small family-run hotels. It was the kind of adventure I'd always dreamed about, but never pursued because Richard had no interest in traveling anywhere that wasn't a golf resort. "I'm in," I told Beth when we met for our morning walk. "Let's go to Italy." Her face lit up with delight. And we spent the rest of our walk talking about itineraries and packing lists and which museums we most wanted to see. It felt indulgent, frivolous, exactly the kind of thing that old Margaret would have denied herself. But new Margaret, the one who'd emerged from the wreckage of her marriage, gave herself permission to pursue joy wherever she could find it. The months leading up to the Italy trip were filled with preparations and small pleasures. I took Italian lessons at the community center, stumbling over pronunciations but enjoying the challenge of learning something new. I bought actual new clothes instead of just making do with what I had, treating myself to comfortable walking shoes and colorful dresses that made me feel attractive and confident. I also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with women who were leaving abusive relationships. My own experience with gaslighting and manipulation helped me understand what they were going through, the confusion and self-doubt and fear that came with recognizing that someone you loved was hurting you. I could offer them something valuable, the perspective of someone who'd gotten out, who'd survived, who'd built a new life on the other side. The women at the shelter were decades younger than me, but we connected on a fundamental level. They appreciated my willingness to listen without judgment, to validate their experiences, to help them trust their own instincts again. And helping them helped me too, reinforcing my own healing and reminding me how far I'd come. When October finally arrived, I boarded a plane to Rome with Beth and 5 other women from our neighborhood. It was my first international trip. The first time I'd flown without Richard. The first time I'd done something purely for my own enjoyment without considering anyone else's needs or preferences. Italy was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. We ate pasta and gelato without guilt, visited museums and churches and ancient ruins, walked along cobblestone streets and through vineyard-covered hillsides. We stayed up late drinking wine and telling stories, sharing our histories and our hopes with the kind of openness that comes from being among women who understand. One afternoon in Florence, I stood in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus at the Uffizi Gallery, staring at the goddess emerging from the sea. I thought about my own rebirth, the painful shedding of my old life and the tentative emergence into something new. I wasn't a goddess, just an ordinary woman who'd survived a terrible betrayal and found the strength to start over. But in that moment, surrounded by art and beauty and the companionship of women who valued me, I felt transcendent. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything that's happened, I'm amazed at how much my life has changed in just 18 months. I'm not going to pretend it's been easy or that I don't still have moments of sadness and anger. The wound Richard inflicted hasn't fully healed, and maybe it never will completely. There are still nights when I lie awake remembering the good times we had, mourning the marriage I thought I had, grieving for the future we'd planned together. But those moments of sadness are increasingly outweighed by moments of joy and freedom. I love my quiet mornings with coffee and a book, no longer interrupted by Richard's complaints or demands. I love my walks with Beth and Charlie, the easy conversation and comfortable silence. I love my book club and my painting class and my volunteer work at the shelter. I love planning trips and trying new restaurants and saying yes to invitations without having to check with anyone else first. Most of all, I love that I trust myself again. When I have an instinct about something, I listen to it instead of dismissing it as paranoia. When someone tries to make me doubt my own perceptions, I recognize the manipulation and shut it down. When I need to set a boundary, I do it without guilt or apology. I've learned that the cost of staying silent, of accepting unacceptable behavior, of sacrificing yourself to maintain a false peace is far too high. I paid that cost for decades, and I nearly lost myself completely in the process. But I found my way back, with help from good therapists and loyal friends and my own stubborn determination to survive. Richard occasionally still tries to contact me, sending emails or leaving voicemails asking how I'm doing, fishing for information about my life, hinting that he'd still like to reconcile. I don't respond. There's nothing left to say to him. Nothing he could offer that would make me reconsider. That part of my life is over, and I'm at peace with that. My children have adjusted to the divorce better than I expected. Emily has thrived without the tension of watching her parents' failing marriage, and she's become one of my closest confidants. James initially struggled with feeling caught between Richard and me, but he's learning to set his own boundaries with his father, to call out manipulative behavior when he sees it. My grandchildren are growing up with a different version of their grandmother than they might have known, one who's present and engaged rather than exhausted and resentful. I take them on adventures to museums and parks and bakeries. I teach them that it's okay to trust your instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, to value yourself enough to walk away from situations that diminish you. The house that Richard and I shared for so many years feels like mine now. I've redecorated, replacing the furniture he chose with pieces I love. I've turned his home office into an art studio where I paint and sketch. I've created a space that reflects who I am rather than who I thought I needed to be. I'm 73 years old, and in some ways, my life is just beginning. I have decades of experience and hard-won wisdom, and I finally have the freedom to use them in ways that fulfill me rather than serve someone else. I'm building a chosen family of friends and fellow travelers, people who see me and value me for who I actually am. If I could go back and talk to the woman I was on that September morning when I discovered Richard's messages, I would tell her that everything she's feeling is valid, that she's not paranoid or crazy or overreacting, that her instincts are right and she should trust them, that the pain she's experiencing is real and legitimate, and she deserves better. I would also tell her that it gets better, slowly and painfully but steadily, that she's stronger than she knows, that there's life after betrayal, joy after grief, peace after chaos, that the marriage ending isn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter. And I would tell her what I've learned most importantly, that silence has a cost. And speaking your truth, even when it's hard, even when people don't want to hear it, is the only way to save yourself. Have you experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has? Please share your story in the comments. And if this resonated with you, if you think someone you know needs to hear it, please like this video and subscribe. These stories need to reach the people who need them most, and your support helps make that happen. Thank you for listening to mine.